A little boy hijacks a billionaire CEO's press conference and says, "Can someone tell my dad that money doesn't hug back?" The man, who never had any children, awkwardly laughs it off before freezing in shock at how familiar the little boy's traits look. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Tristan Carlisle stood before a sea of flashing cameras and eager reporters, his tailored navy suit crisp under the bright conference lights. The press conference was meant to be another well-orchestrated display of his company's latest triumph, an acquisition worth billions that would further cement his legacy as a business titan. His voice was steady, confident, as he detailed the strategic advantages of the merger, fielding questions with the sharp precision that had made him one of the most respected and feared CEOs in the industry. Then, just as he was about to introduce the next speaker, a small commotion rippled through the audience. A security guard moved abruptly, and a second later, a tiny figure darted past the podium. At first, Tristan barely registered it, assuming some rogue reporter had broken protocol. But then the little boy grabbed the microphone, his voice ringing out through the speakers with unwavering confidence. "Can someone tell my dad that money doesn't hug back?" The room went silent. Tristan, who had faced down aggressive investors, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes negotiations without flinching, found himself momentarily frozen. A flicker of laughter rippled through the audience, reporters glancing at one another in disbelief, some already reaching for their phones to type out breaking headlines. Tristan forced a chuckle, an attempt to brush off the bizarre interruption. "Well, that's certainly interesting. Security, if you could." He gestured vaguely toward the boy, expecting his team to handle the situation. But as the child turned to face him directly, Tristan felt an odd sense of déjà vu. The boy had tousled brown hair, a sharp gaze filled with mischievous determination, and a smirk that looked unsettlingly familiar. Too familiar. Security had already stepped in, gently guiding the boy away, but Tristan's mind had disconnected from the rest of the conference. The questions from reporters became white noise as he watched the child being escorted out of the room, still standing tall despite the fact that he just hijacked a multi-million-dollar corporate event. The boy barely put up a fight. He just turned his head over his shoulder and locked eyes with Tristan one last time, his expression unreadable. And then he was gone. Tristan cleared his throat, shaking off the moment. "Apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly, forcing his CEO mask back into place. "Now, as I was saying," he launched back into the talking points, but a knot had formed in his stomach, and it refused to go away. By the time the conference ended, the incident had already gone viral. News outlets were having a field day. Who is the mystery boy who crashed billionaire Tristan Carlisle's press conference? Speculation ranged from a publicity stunt to a child genius making a statement about wealth inequality. Social media had wasted no time turning the moment into memes, with one particularly popular post showing a screenshot of the boy mid-speech with the caption, "POV, your long-lost kid calls you out in front of the world." Tristan ignored the media frenzy, as he always did, and headed straight for his office. Yet, no matter how much he tried to bury himself in work, his mind kept circling back to the boy. There was something about him, his stance, his smirk, the way he had spoken with such certainty. The familiarity gnawed at him like an unsolved puzzle. Hours later, as the city outside his office windows twinkled with the glow of nightfall, he found himself pulling open a drawer in his desk, reaching for an old leather-bound photo album he hadn't touched in years. He flipped through pages of childhood memories, grainy pictures of a boy with messy brown hair, a sharp gaze, and a mischievous smirk. Himself. Tristan stared at the faded photograph, then back at the image of the little boy burned into his memory from earlier that day. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a vague resemblance, it was uncanny. The shape of the nose, the way the brow arched slightly when concentrating, even the way the corners of his mouth twitched upward as if he was always on the verge of causing trouble. It was impossible. He had never had children. He had never even been close to marriage. His relationships were fleeting, superficial, nothing that could have resulted in a cold wave of realization hit him. Hannah Wells? A name he hadn't spoken aloud in nearly a decade, but it remained lodged in the back of his mind like an unfinished chapter. He had loved her once, deeply, recklessly. They had been young, and for a while, he had truly believed she was his future. But life had pulled them apart. His career had demanded everything, and in the end, Hannah had walked away, telling him she refused to compete with a corporation for his attention. He had let her go, convinced at the time that it was for the best. But now, years later, a little boy had appeared out of nowhere, looking exactly like him at that age. And if the impossible was somehow true, if Hannah had left with more than just a broken heart, then Tristan had just spent years oblivious to the existence of his own son. A sharp knock on his office door startled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Ben, stepped in, holding a tablet with an amused expression. "You've seen the headlines, right?" Ben asked, scrolling through an article. "Little boy claims to be billionaire's son, a new heir to the Carlyle empire?" He chuckled. "Gotta say, boss, if this is true, your PR team's gonna have a meltdown." Tristan barely heard him. His pulse was hammering in his ears. "I need you to find out everything you can about that kid," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "Now." Ben's smirk faded at Tristan's serious tone. "You think he might actually be?" Tristan didn't answer. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet. But deep down, something told him he already knew the answer. Tristan barely slept that night. He had tried, tossing and turning in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, telling himself it was ridiculous. A coincidence. A strange trick of genetics. But every time he closed his eyes, the boy's face was there, his smirk, his stance, the way he had stood so confidently in front of a room full of people and called him out without a flicker of hesitation. It wasn't just the resemblance that haunted him. It was the feeling that had gripped him the moment their eyes met, like the universe was telling him something he had been too blind to see. At some point in the early hours, he had given up on sleep entirely. He sat in his office, leaning back in his chair, absently spinning a gold pen between his fingers. The photo album still lay open on his desk, turned to that old picture of himself as a boy, wide-eyed, grinning mischievously, a tuft of brown hair falling messily over his forehead. The resemblance wasn't just close. It was exact. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ben walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee, looking far too awake for someone who had been bombarded with PR nightmares all day. He set one of the cups down in front of Tristan, giving him a knowing look. "You look like hell," Ben said. "Which is impressive, considering you usually make looking like hell look expensive." Tristan ignored the jab, rubbing his eyes before taking a long sip of coffee. "Did you find anything?" Ben sat down across from him, pulling out his phone. "Oh yeah? Our little conference crasher is named Oliver Wells. 8 years old. Lives in the city. Single mom, no father listed on the birth certificate. Mom's name." He paused for dramatic effect. "Hannah Wells?" Tristan's grip on his coffee tightened. He had already suspected it, but hearing it confirmed still sent a jolt through him. Ben watched him closely, then leaned back with a smirk. "So, are we gonna talk about the fact that you apparently have a long-lost son, or should I just start prepping the billionaire daddy headlines now?" Tristan shot him a sharp look. "I don't know if he's mine." "Sure. And I don't know if water is wet." Tristan exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down. "Hannah never told me she was pregnant." Ben whistled. "That's cold." There was a flicker of something unreadable in Tristan's expression before he forced it away. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "She left almost a decade ago. I haven't heard from her since." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me that the only woman you've ever actually looked heartbroken over just happened to disappear from your life and ended up with a kid that looks exactly like you? Dude." He gestured toward the photo album on Tristan's desk. "I hate to break it to you, but if there was ever a time to embrace fatherhood, this is it." Tristan ran a hand down his face. "It doesn't make sense. Hannah wasn't, she wouldn't have kept something like this from me." Maybe she had a good reason, Ben suggested. Or maybe you were so buried in your work that you didn't even notice. Tristan didn't respond. A quiet weight settled in the room. He thought back to those days, when he and Hannah had been inseparable, when he had believed, for the first time in his life, that he might actually be capable of something more than just ambition. But his career had taken over, consuming every part of him. The late nights, the cancelled plans, the way Hannah had looked at him near the end, tired and disappointed. I need to talk to her, Tristan said finally. I need to know the truth. Ben clapped his hands together. Finally, some action. I'll track her down, no, Tristan interrupted. I'll do it myself. Ben gave him a skeptical look. You? Personally tracking someone down? That's adorable. Tristan ignored him, already reaching for his coat. The address Ben had found led him to a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, lined with townhouses that looked well-kept but modest. It was a stark contrast to the high-rise luxury Tristan was used to, but it fit Hannah. She had never cared for extravagant things. As he stepped out of his car, he hesitated for the first time. He had built his entire life on being in control, always knowing the next move. But right now, standing in front of Hannah's door, he had no idea what he was walking into. Still, he knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. And there she was. Hannah Wells looked almost exactly the same, yet completely different. Her auburn hair was shorter now, tucked behind her ears, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. But the moment she saw him, her expression hardened. She crossed her arms. Wow! Tristan Carlyle. To what do I owe the pleasure? Tristan opened his mouth, but for the first time in his life, words failed him. How was he supposed to start this conversation? Hey, Hannah, long time no see. Quick question, did you secretly have my child and just forget to mention it? Instead, he said, I saw him. Hannah's face didn't change, but there was the slightest shift in her stance. I don't know what you're talking about. Tristan narrowed his eyes. Yes, you do. Oliver. He showed up at my press conference today. Hannah exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. Oh, for God, that kid! Tristan watched her carefully. So, he is mine. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, she took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. You do not get to show up here after 8 years and demand answers. I think I deserve at least that. She let out a humorless laugh. Deserve? Tristan, you didn't even know I was gone. The words hit harder than he expected. There was a long silence. Then, Hannah shook her head, as if shaking away whatever emotion had almost surfaced. Whatever you think you're doing, stop. Oliver has a good life. He doesn't need you messing it up. Tristan didn't flinch. And what about you? Hannah hesitated, just for a second. Then, she stepped back and started to close the door. This conversation is over. Tristan caught the door before it shut completely, his hand pressing lightly against the wood. You can keep pretending, but we both know the truth. And so does Oliver. Her grip on the doorframe tightened. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but instead, she sighed and pulled the door shut. Tristan stood there for a long time. Then, finally, he turned and walked away. But he wasn't done. Not yet. Tristan sat in the back seat of his car, staring out at the quiet street as the rain drizzled lightly against the windows. Hannah had shut him out, her words still echoing in his mind. You didn't even know I was gone. She had been right about that, and it stung more than he cared to admit. He had spent the past decade drowning in work, convinced that success required sacrifice, that love was a distraction he couldn't afford. And now, staring at the house where she lived with his son, a son he had never known existed, he wondered just how much he had truly lost. Back at his office the next morning, Tristan was already pulling up every resource available. He had contacts everywhere, from government officials to private security firms, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate. It was his past, a piece of his life he hadn't even realized was missing. And if Hannah wasn't going to tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. He picked up the phone. "Get me someone who can dig into personal records." Quietly. By the afternoon, his go-to private investigator, Dean McAllister, was standing in front of his desk, flipping through a slim folder. "Didn't think I'd ever be pulling up your personal dirt," Dean said with a smirk. "This one's interesting." Tristan took the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned over the information, his mind racing through the details. There it was, Oliver Wells, born 8 years ago. Mother, Hannah Wells. Father, none listed. Tristan's stomach tightened. "There's nothing here tying me to him." Dean leaned against the desk. "Yeah, well, that's the legal part. Now this." He pulled out another document from his jacket and set it in front of Tristan. "This is where it gets messy." Tristan's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper as he read. It was a legal contract, dated 8.5 years ago. His signature was at the bottom. Termination of parental rights. Tristan's breath hitched. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was looking at. This isn't possible. I never signed this." Dean gave him a pointed look. "You did. Or at least, you thought you were signing something else. Look at the details. Buried in a bunch of business paperwork. My guess? You were knee-deep in some corporate expansion, didn't read the fine print, and boom, signed away rights to a kid you didn't even know about." Tristan felt a sickening weight settle in his chest. He vaguely remembered that time in his life. He had been on the verge of his biggest business move yet, working insane hours, signing contracts left and right. He hadn't been paying attention to anything outside of work. But Hannah, had she known what she was asking him to sign? Had she done it because she thought he wouldn't care? His jaw tightened. "I need to talk to her," Dean snorted. "Yeah, well, considering she already shut the door in your face, I'd say that's gonna be an uphill battle." Tristan wasn't deterred. He had spent his entire life fighting to get what he wanted, to build an empire from nothing. This was different, this was personal, but he wasn't about to walk away. Later that evening, he found himself outside Hannah's house once again. This time, he didn't knock. He waited. Sure enough, just as he suspected, the door eventually opened, and Hannah stepped out, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. She didn't notice him at first, too caught up in whatever thoughts were running through her head. But when she looked up and saw him standing by his car, her face hardened instantly. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" she muttered, walking past him toward her driveway. Tristan followed. "You didn't tell me." She sighed, already looking exhausted. "Tristan, you had me sign this." He pulled the document from his coat pocket, unfolding it and holding it out to her. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Hannah froze. For a second, something flickered in her expression. Guilt? Pain? He wasn't sure. But then her jaw set, and she shook her head. "I didn't have you sign anything. You did that all on your own. Because I didn't know what I was signing." She turned to face him fully now, crossing her arms. "And whose fault is that?" His patience was thinning. "You should have told me." "Told you?" Her voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through. "Tristan, you didn't even notice I was leaving. You were so buried in work, in deals, in that empire you were building, I could have disappeared off the face of the earth, and you wouldn't have blinked." Tristan opened his mouth to argue, but she wasn't done. "I was pregnant, alone, scared out of my mind, and I knew you. I knew that if I told you, you'd feel obligated. You'd force yourself to be involved because you'd think it was the right thing to do. And I didn't want to trap you like that. So yeah, I made my choice. I walked away. And you," she motioned toward the contract still in his hand, "made yours." Tristan felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years perfecting his ability to keep emotions at bay, to approach everything with logic and control. But Hannah had always been the exception to that rule. "I didn't choose this," he said, quieter this time. She let out a humorless laugh. "Didn't you? You chose work. You chose everything else. She exhaled, shaking her head. Look, I don't hate you, Tristan. But Oliver isn't some business deal you can renegotiate. He's a kid. My kid. And I will not let you walk into his life just to walk right back out. Tristan wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't that man anymore, that he had spent the last 24 hours questioning every decision that had led him here. But before he could speak, the front door opened, and a small voice called out, "Mom?" Oliver stood in the doorway, blinking at them both. His gaze flickered between them, and for a brief moment, Tristan saw something almost hopeful in his eyes. Hannah turned, forcing a small smile. "Go inside, sweetheart. I'll be there in a minute." Oliver hesitated, his gaze lingering on Tristan before he finally nodded and disappeared inside. Tristan took a step forward. "You can't keep me from him." Hannah's face hardened again. "Watch me." Before he could say another word, she turned and went inside, shutting the door behind her. Tristan stood there for a long moment, the chill of the night settling into his bones. She wasn't going to make this easy. Good. He didn't want easy. He wanted them. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something more than just success. Tristan wasn't a man who took no for an answer. He had built an empire on persistence, turning failing businesses into powerhouses through sheer force of will. But standing on Hannah's doorstep after she had slammed the door in his face for the second time in as many days, he realized this was going to be the hardest negotiation of his life. Because Hannah Wells wasn't some competitor he could outmaneuver or an investor he could charm. She was a mother, and she was protecting her son. His son. The words still felt foreign in his mind, too big to fully grasp. He had spent years believing his life was exactly as it should be, carefully structured, ruthlessly efficient, free of any unnecessary complications. And now, in the span of 48 hours, he had an 8-year-old son who had declared his existence in front of a room full of reporters, and a woman from his past who was hellbent on keeping him out. Tristan wasn't backing down. The next morning, he was back. This time, he wasn't showing up unannounced. He was waiting, leaning casually against his sleek black car as Hannah stepped out of the house, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. She stopped short the second she saw him, sighing so hard her shoulders drooped. "Seriously?" she muttered. "Do I need to get a restraining order?" Tristan pushed off the car, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Would that be before or after we have an actual conversation?" She narrowed her eyes. "I thought we already did. You know, the one where I told you to stay out of our lives?" "You told me a lot of things," Tristan said. "And I ignored most of them." Hannah let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, this is going to be fun." She started toward her car, clearly intent on leaving him standing there, but Tristan stepped in front of the driver's side door. "Just give me 5 minutes," he said. She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because I deserve a chance." She scoffed. "You deserve nothing, Tristan. You don't get to disappear for 8 years and then waltz back in with a billionaire smile, expecting me to hand you the son you didn't even know you had." Tristan didn't flinch. "I didn't disappear, Hannah. You walked away." Her jaw tightened. "Because you made it impossible to stay." The words hit harder than he expected, but before he could respond, the front door creaked open, and Oliver stepped outside. His eyes brightened the second he saw Tristan. "Are you stalking us?" Oliver asked bluntly, his voice full of curiosity rather than concern. Tristan smirked. "That depends. Are you going to call the cops on me?" Oliver considered it for a moment, then grinned. "I think I'd rather interrogate you first." Hannah groaned. "Oliver, go back inside." But Oliver was already trotting down the steps, stopping a few feet from Tristan. His gaze was sharp, analytical, and far too observant for an 8-year-old. "Do billionaires eat normal food?" Oliver asked suddenly. Tristan blinked. "What? Like, do you eat cereal? Or do you just have people bring you, like diamond toast or something?" Tristan glanced at Hannah, who was rubbing her temples like she regretted ever having a child in the first place. He looked back at Oliver and shrugged. I had a Pop-Tart this morning. Oliver's eyes widened. Really? Strawberry. Oliver nodded approvingly. Respect. Tristan smirked. Glad to hear it. Hannah groaned again. I don't have time for this. Oliver, go get your bag. We're going to be late. Oliver frowned. Can Tristan come? No, Hannah and Tristan said at the same time. Oliver crossed his arms. Why not? Hannah shot Tristan a glare before softening her voice for Oliver. Because he's not part of our routine. Oliver looked up at Tristan, then back at Hannah, clearly displeased with that answer. But he wants to be. Tristan felt something tighten in his chest. Hannah sighed. Go inside, kiddo. Oliver pouted but eventually obeyed, trudging back into the house. The second he was out of earshot, Hannah turned back to Tristan, her expression unreadable. I mean it, Tristan. You don't get to come in here and confuse him. Tristan exhaled slowly. I'm not trying to confuse him. I just want to know him. Hannah hesitated. For the first time, there was something uncertain in her expression. And then what? What? She stepped forward, her voice quieter now. And then what, Tristan? You get to know him, he gets to know you, and then what happens when you decide you're done? When work gets too busy? When being a dad stops being some novelty and starts being an actual responsibility? Tristan stared at her. You think I'd just walk away? I think I can't take that risk, Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think Oliver deserves better than a dad who might love him when it's convenient. The words stung. Not because they were cruel, but because they weren't entirely unfounded. Tristan had always put work first. He had let Hannah walk away without fighting for her, too consumed with his ambition to see what he was losing. And now, standing here, faced with the consequences of that, he realized he had a lot to prove. Not just to Hannah, but to Oliver. I'm not leaving, Tristan said finally. I don't know what this is going to look like, or how we figure it out, but I'm not leaving. Hannah studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I have to get him to school. Tristan nodded. He stepped back, allowing her to get into the car, watching as she pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. He had gotten farther than he expected. But he still had a long way to go. Tristan hadn't expected to leave that morning feeling anything but frustration. Hannah was a wall he couldn't break through, and no matter how many arguments he tried to present, she wasn't budging. He had spent his entire life convincing people to trust him with their investments, their companies, their futures. But this wasn't business. This was personal, and personal had never been his strong suit. So, for once, he decided to listen. He told himself he would back off, give her space, let her come to terms with the fact that he wasn't going anywhere. Maybe he needed to prove it through actions instead of words. Maybe, just maybe, she would see that he wasn't the same man she had walked away from all those years ago. That decision lasted exactly 5 hours. The call came in the middle of a meeting, his phone vibrating insistently against the conference table. He ignored it at first, focused on the numbers flashing across the screen as one of his executives droned on about quarterly projections. Then it buzzed again. And again. Ben, sitting beside him, leaned over. That's the hospital, he murmured. Tristan's stomach clenched. He stood abruptly, ignoring the confused looks from the room as he grabbed his phone and answered. Mr. Carlyle? A calm but urgent voice said on the other end. I'm calling from St. Vincent's Hospital. We have a patient here, Hannah Wells. She was in a severe car accident this afternoon. Tristan's heart stopped. What? She's in critical condition. We need you to come in immediately. He didn't even remember the drive to the hospital. 1 minute he was in his office, and the next, he was pushing through the emergency room doors, his pulse hammering in his ears. The scent of antiseptic and the low murmur of voices blurred around him as he scanned the waiting area. Then he saw him. Oliver sat in one of the stiff plastic chairs, his small hands clenched together, his face pale and drawn. His legs swung slightly, not quite touching the floor. He looked up just as Tristan approached, his eyes wide, filled with something Tristan wasn't prepared for, pure, unfiltered fear. Tristan knelt in front of him. "Hey, kid!" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Oliver swallowed hard. "They won't let me see her." Tristan glanced up as a nurse approached. She looked between the two of them, recognition flashing in her eyes. The press conference incident had made its rounds, after all. "You're Mr. Carlyle?" she asked gently. Tristan nodded. "How is she?" The nurse hesitated. "She's stable for now, but her injuries are severe. The doctors are doing everything they can. She'll need weeks, maybe months of recovery." Tristan exhaled sharply. He turned back to Oliver, who was staring at the floor, his small hands curled into fists. "Where am I supposed to go?" Oliver whispered. Tristan felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He looked at the nurse, already knowing the answer before she said it. "He has no other listed guardians," she confirmed. "Until we know more about Ms. Wells' condition, someone needs to take care of him." Tristan hesitated for only a second. Then he placed a hand on Oliver's shoulder, steady and certain. "I've got him." Oliver looked up at him, eyes searching. "You mean that?" Tristan nodded. "Yeah, kid. I do." Tristan had built an empire. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, crushed competitors, and taken over failing companies with a single signature. None of that had prepared him for taking care of an 8-year-old. The first few hours were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and arrangements. By the time Tristan had finished speaking with the hospital's social worker and confirming he would be taking temporary custody of Oliver, it was well past midnight. The kid was exhausted, barely staying awake as Tristan led him through the underground parking lot to his car. Oliver climbed into the back seat without a word, buckling himself in before staring blankly out the window. He hadn't cried, not once, but the silence felt heavier than tears. Tristan slid into the driver's seat and hesitated before speaking. "You hungry?" Oliver shrugged. "I dunno." Tristan glanced at the time. "McDonald's is still open." Oliver turned to look at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you trying to bribe me with fries?" Tristan smirked despite himself. "Is it working?" Oliver considered this. "Depends. Do I get a milkshake?" "Done." That earned him a tiny, reluctant smile. Tristan drove them to the nearest drive-thru, ordering enough food to last them through the apocalypse. By the time they reached his penthouse, Oliver was gripping his Happy Meal like a lifeline, staring up at the massive glass building with wide eyes. "Whoa," he muttered. "You live here?" Tristan smirked. "I do." Oliver stepped inside, glancing around the sleek, modern space, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, polished marble floors, expensive furniture that no kid had ever set foot near. Oliver turned to him, completely serious. "I'm gonna break so many things." Tristan let out a low chuckle. "Try not to break me first, okay?" By the time Tristan had gotten Oliver settled into one of the guest bedrooms, the kid was barely keeping his eyes open. He had eaten exactly 4 fries before pushing his food away, exhaustion taking over. Tristan stood in the doorway, watching as Oliver flopped onto the massive bed, burying himself under the covers. After a long pause, Oliver's voice drifted through the dim room. "She's gonna be okay, right?" Tristan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, kid. She's tough." Oliver nodded against the pillow. "You promise?" Tristan hesitated for only a second before replying. "I promise." Oliver was asleep within minutes. Tristan stayed in the doorway for a long time after that, staring at the small, curled-up figure in the oversized bed. He had spent years believing he had everything. But standing there, watching his son sleep for the first time in his life, he realized how wrong he had been. He had been missing everything. Tristan had expected his life to change when he took Oliver in, at least temporarily. What he hadn't expected was just how much it would change. His once perfectly structured days, ruled by schedules and efficiency, had been completely upended by the presence of an 8-year-old tornado with zero respect for business hours or personal space. His mornings, which once started with quiet coffee and reviewing the financial markets, now began with Oliver dramatically flopping onto his bed at ungodly hours, demanding to know why billionaires didn't have normal alarms like everyone else. His penthouse, once pristine and sleek, now had suspiciously sticky spots on the marble floor, a few scattered Lego landmines, and a growing collection of stuffed animals Oliver had smuggled in from Hannah's house before Tristan could question it. And then, of course, there were the meals. Tristan had never needed to cook before. His kitchen was more of a status symbol than anything functional, stocked with expensive appliances he had never actually touched. The first morning after Oliver moved in, Tristan had decided he would make a simple breakfast, nothing fancy, just some toast and scrambled eggs. How hard could it be? As it turned out, very. The toast had gone up in smoke within minutes, setting off the penthouse's fire alarm system. Oliver had walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, just as Tristan was waving a dish towel frantically at the ceiling. Oliver blinked at the chaos, then sighed heavily. "You run a billion-dollar company but can't make a piece of toast? We're doomed." Tristan scowled, tossing the burnt toast into the sink. "It was defective." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "The bread was defective?" "Yes." Oliver stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "I'm calling Ben." Tristan groaned. "You do not need to call Ben." But it was too late. Oliver had already grabbed Tristan's phone and hit the speed dial. A few seconds later, Ben's voice came through the speaker. "This better be important." "I was sleeping." Tristan tried to cook. There was a beat of silence. Then Ben said, "I'll be right over." Tristan snatched the phone away. "No, you will not." But 20 minutes later, Ben strolled in with coffee in one hand and a knowing smirk on his face. He took one look at the kitchen, where the smoke alarm was still blinking ominously, and shook his head. "This is why rich people aren't allowed in kitchens," Tristan groaned. "Just make the kid breakfast before he calls child services on me." Ben grinned and ruffled Oliver's hair. "Come on, kid. Let's save your dad from himself." Tristan ignored the way his chest tightened at the word dad. It wasn't official, wasn't something they had even discussed, but Oliver had started using the term like it was the most natural thing in the world. And strangely, Tristan hadn't corrected him. By the time breakfast was over, successfully handled by Ben, Tristan had to rush off to the office. He had a back-to-back schedule of meetings, investor calls, and a press interview, but as he stepped toward the door, he hesitated. He turned to Oliver, who was already making himself comfortable on the couch with a bowl of cereal. "You gonna be okay here for a few hours?" Oliver waved a spoon in his direction. "I'm 8. I'll survive." Tristan narrowed his eyes. "That's not reassuring." Ben clapped him on the shoulder. "Relax, boss. I'll keep an eye on him." Tristan hesitated for another second before nodding. "Fine. I'll be back later." He made it almost to lunchtime before Oliver caused an incident. Tristan was in the middle of an executive meeting when his assistant stormed in, looking flustered. "Sir, we have a situation." Tristan frowned. "What kind of situation?" She hesitated. "A pizza situation." Tristan blinked. "What?" Ben suddenly burst into the room, looking far too amused. "Your kid just ordered 12 large pizzas on your company credit card." Tristan stared at him. "He what?" "Yeah. Apparently, he called the most expensive pizza place in town and said, and I quote, 'Charge it to my dad's big business card.'" The boardroom was silent. Then one of the executives snorted, and soon the entire room was laughing. Tristan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Where is he now?" Ben grinned. "Eating pizza in your office." Tristan groaned but found himself unable to actually be mad. When he walked into his office 10 minutes later, he found Oliver sitting on the couch, a slice of pizza in each hand, looking absolutely unbothered. Tristan crossed his arms. "You have one job while I'm at work." Oliver chewed thoughtfully. "Which is?" "Not committing credit card fraud." Oliver wiped his hands on a napkin. "I think it's only fraud if I lied." Tristan pinched the bridge of his nose. That is not how that works. Oliver grinned. Okay, but hear me out, what if it was? Tristan sighed. You're impossible. Oliver popped another bite of pizza into his mouth. And yet you still let me stay. Tristan sat down beside him, shaking his head. Yeah, well, someone's gotta make sure you don't take over my company while I'm gone. Oliver smirked. Give it a few years. Tristan chuckled despite himself. He hadn't expected any of this, hadn't expected to feel so attached already. But every time Oliver called him Dad without thinking, every time he made some sarcastic remark that sounded exactly like something Tristan himself would say, it settled something in his chest that he hadn't realized was missing. He had spent his whole life chasing success, believing that the next deal, the next billion-dollar merger, the next power move was what mattered. But none of it had ever made him feel like this. Like he had something real. Like he finally had something worth keeping. Tristan had never been good at waiting. He was used to taking action, solving problems, closing deals before anyone else had the chance. But as he sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside Hannah's bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest, he realized there was nothing he could do but wait. It had been a week since the accident, a week since he had taken Oliver in, and a week since his carefully controlled life had been turned inside out. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was losing control. If anything, he felt like he was finally finding something. Oliver was curled up in the chair beside him, head resting on Tristan's arm as he slept. He had insisted on staying at the hospital every chance he got, refusing to leave his mother's side. Tristan had stayed too, not just because Oliver needed him, but because he needed to be there. For Hannah. And then, just as the sun started creeping through the hospital blinds, she stirred. Tristan straightened, his heart kicking up as her eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. She blinked a few times, then slowly turned her head toward him. For a long moment, she just stared, as if she wasn't sure if she was still dreaming. Then her gaze flickered downward, landing on Oliver, still asleep against Tristan. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. What? What are you doing here? Tristan exhaled, relief washing over him at the sound of her voice. I could ask you the same thing, but I think the car wreck explains it. She let out a weak, almost amused breath before her expression turned wary. Why are you here? Tristan met her gaze, steady and certain. Because I wasn't going to let Oliver go through this alone. And because I wasn't going to let you go through this alone either. She swallowed hard, looking away as if she wasn't ready to process that. How long have I been out? 6 days. Her brows furrowed. And you just stayed? Tristan nodded. Yeah. Her lips parted slightly, but whatever she wanted to say was lost when Oliver stirred beside him. The little boy let out a sleepy mumble before his eyes cracked open. It took only a second for him to realize what was happening, and the moment he did, he bolted upright. Mom? Hannah barely had time to react before Oliver threw himself onto her, wrapping his arms around her as tightly as he could. She let out a small, pained noise, but she didn't stop him. Instead, she just closed her eyes, holding him just as fiercely. Tristan looked away, giving them the moment. After a few long minutes, Oliver finally pulled back, his eyes still glassy with emotion. You scared me, he muttered. Hannah cupped his face, brushing his hair back. I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. Oliver sniffled, then glanced at Tristan before turning back to his mom. Tristan took care of me. Hannah's gaze flickered toward Tristan again, unreadable. Did he? Oliver nodded. Yeah. He kinda sucks at cooking, but we ordered pizza a lot, so it worked out. Tristan rolled his eyes. Thanks for the glowing review, kid. Hannah let out a small, tired chuckle before shifting slightly, wincing as she did. Tristan immediately straightened. Easy. The doctor said you need to take it slow. She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her gaze. You really stayed? I did, Tristan said softly. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things either of them were quite ready to say. Oliver, oblivious to the tension, sat back down beside Tristan, leaning against him with the ease of someone who had already decided Tristan belonged in his life. Hannah noticed. "Look," Tristan finally said. "I know we have a lot to talk about. I know you don't trust me yet, and I don't blame you for that. But I'm not going anywhere this time." Hannah swallowed. "That's easy to say when you're in a hospital room." Tristan nodded. "I know. That's why I did something else." She frowned. "What does that mean?" Tristan hesitated for only a second before speaking. "I stepped down." Her eyes widened slightly. "You what?" "I took a leave of absence from the company. I handed over operations to my executives for now." Hannah looked completely thrown. "Why would you do that?" "Because for years I told myself that nothing mattered more than work. That Carlisle Industries had to be my priority, no matter what. And that cost me. You. And Oliver. I didn't even know what I lost until now." He took a slow breath. "I'm not making that mistake again." For the first time since she had woken up, Hannah looked truly speechless. Tristan leaned forward slightly, keeping his gaze locked with hers. "I never stopped loving you, Hannah." She sucked in a quiet breath, but he wasn't finished. "I know I have a lot to prove. I know I let you down before, and I can't change the past. But if you'll let me, I want to be in Oliver's life. In your life. Not just for a few weeks, not just while you're recovering, but for good." Hannah swallowed hard, her eyes searching his as if trying to find the catch. Oliver, who had been listening with wide eyes, suddenly brightened. "Does this mean you're gonna marry Mom?" Hannah let out a choked sound. "Oliver." Oliver shrugged. "What?" "It makes sense." Tristan smirked. "He's got a point." Hannah groaned, pressing a hand over her eyes. "Oh my God!" Oliver grinned. "So that's a yes?" Tristan chuckled. "It's a maybe." Hannah shot him a glare. "It's a slow down." Tristan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough." But as he met her gaze again, something passed between them, something quiet, something real. She wasn't ready to trust him completely yet. But for the first time, she was considering it. And that was enough for now. Tristan had never been nervous about a business deal in his life. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, faced off against ruthless competitors, and made decisions that shaped industries. But standing in his kitchen, watching the oven timer count down, he felt a level of anxiety he hadn't experienced before. It had been a month since Hannah was discharged from the hospital, a month of slow healing and cautious interactions, of him proving in small ways that he wasn't going anywhere this time. He had taken Oliver to school, helped with homework, learned, the hard way, that 8-year-olds had very strong opinions on bedtime negotiations. And more importantly, he had given Hannah space, knowing trust wasn't something he could demand, it had to be earned. But tonight, he wasn't waiting anymore. He was making his move. Ben had laughed himself hoarse when Tristan told him he was planning a homemade dinner instead of some extravagant billionaire-style gesture. "So this is what domestic Tristan looks like," Ben had said. "I gotta say, it's unsettling." Tristan didn't care. If he had learned anything in the past few weeks, it was that Hannah didn't want grand gestures or expensive gifts. She wanted effort. And tonight, he was giving her exactly that. He checked the table one last time, candles, but not too fancy. A bottle of wine, but not the kind that screamed "I'm trying too hard." And in the center, a plate of smoke suddenly billowed from the oven. Tristan cursed, rushing to yank open the door, only to be met with a wave of heat and a very burnt attempt at chicken parmesan. From behind him, Oliver's voice piped up. "You know, if you wanted Mom to like you again, poisoning her probably isn't the move." Tristan turned, glaring at the child who was casually eating grapes and watching the disaster unfold. "It's fine," Tristan muttered, grabbing a spatula and trying to salvage the meal. Oliver leaned against the counter. "Ben told me to tell you that rich people shouldn't be left alone in kitchens." Tristan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Ben needs a hobby. Oliver grinned. This is his hobby. Before Tristan could respond, the doorbell rang. Panic settled in. He turned to Oliver. Distract her for 2 minutes. Oliver blinked. How? I don't know, do kid things. Oliver rolled his eyes. That is not specific. But he trudged off to the door, and a second later, Tristan heard Hannah's warm voice. Hey, sweetheart. What's going on? Oliver, always quick on his feet, immediately blurted. Tristan burned dinner. Tristan groaned. Traitor. Hannah appeared in the doorway, raising an amused eyebrow. So, this was supposed to be dinner? Tristan exhaled, setting down the ruined spatula. It was supposed to be a surprise. Apparently, I'm incapable of making anything that isn't flammable. She crossed her arms, a slow smile tugging at her lips. You cooked for me? He cleared his throat. Well, technically, I attempted to cook for you. The result is still up for debate. Hannah stepped further into the kitchen, looking at the set table, the dim candles, the effort he had clearly put into it. Something in her gaze softened. You recreated our first date. Tristan shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Sort of. You know, minus the part where the restaurant actually served edible food. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. You really didn't have to do this. I know, he said quietly. But I wanted to. Hannah's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but then Oliver dramatically slid onto a stool, grabbing a napkin and a pen. Okay, let's settle this like grown-ups, Oliver declared. He scribbled something onto the napkin, then slid it across the table toward Hannah. Check yes or no if you want to keep him. Tristan groaned. Oliver. Hannah bit her lip, glancing between the napkin and Tristan. Kid, you can't just ask someone that. Tristan muttered. Why not? Oliver asked. You like Mom. Mom likes you. You both suck at admitting it. I'm speeding things up. Tristan sighed. Pretty sure that's not how this works. Hannah, still smiling, picked up the pen. She hesitated for a moment, then made a slow, exaggerated checkmark. Yes, she murmured. Tristan stilled. Oliver fist pumped. Ha! I knew it! Hannah rolled her eyes but turned back to Tristan, her expression softer now. You don't give up, do you? Tristan swallowed, stepping closer. Not when it's something worth fighting for. She exhaled, then nodded. Then I guess we should see where this goes. Tristan felt something inside him settle, something that had been off-kilter for years. He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. Sounds like a plan. Oliver, who had clearly had enough of the mushy moment, suddenly clapped his hands. Okay, great. Now that you guys are basically married, can we play a board game? I need to destroy Tristan at Monopoly. Tristan smirked. You wish. Hannah shook her head, amused. Just so you know, he's ruthless. Oliver cracked his knuckles dramatically. So am I. They ended up on the living room floor, battling it out over an intense game of Monopoly, where Oliver somehow convinced Hannah to team up against Tristan. Mom, if we take him down now, we control the economy. Tristan, despite being an actual businessman, was mercilessly outmaneuvered by an 8-year-old. As laughter filled the room, as Hannah leaned into him like she had all those years ago, as Oliver grinned like he had already claimed victory, Tristan realized something. For years, he had believed his life was complete. That his empire, his wealth, his success was enough. But now, sitting in the middle of his living room, playing a board game with his family, he knew the truth. They were the only deal that had ever truly mattered. Tristan sat back against the couch, arms stretched along the cushions as he watched Oliver ruthlessly bankrupt Hannah in their increasingly competitive Monopoly match. The boy was a shark, and Tristan was both impressed and slightly terrified by his ability to manipulate the game to his advantage. Hannah groaned dramatically, throwing up her hands. I can't believe I trusted you. I thought we were in this together. Oliver grinned as he slid her last property into his growing empire. It's just business, Mom. Tristan chuckled. That's definitely my kid. Hannah shot him a playful glare. You taught him this. Hey, don't blame me, Tristan said, smirking. Blame capitalism. Hannah shook her head, but there was laughter in her eyes. Oliver, still basking in his victory, leaned back with a sigh. This was fun. Tristan glanced at him. Yeah? Yeah. Oliver fiddled with a game piece, then looked up. I like this. Us. Something warm spread through Tristan's chest, something deep and unfamiliar, yet completely right. He had spent years building something that was supposed to fulfill him, believing success would be enough. But in the end, this, a quiet night filled with laughter, board games, and people who mattered, was worth more than anything he had ever built. Hannah caught his gaze, something knowing in her expression. He wondered if she could see it, the way he had changed, the way he had needed this more than he ever realized. Oliver stretched his arms over his head, letting out a yawn. So, are we doing take your kid to work day or what? Tristan raised an eyebrow. I don't remember agreeing to that. Oliver scoffed. You owe me. I let you move in. Tristan smirked. You let me move in? Yep. This is my house now. You just live in it. Tristan shot Hannah a look. He gets this from you. She laughed. Oh, absolutely not. This is all you. Oliver, still looking completely serious, crossed his arms. So? Can I go to your office or not? Tristan pretended to think about it. Well, I guess I could use a business partner. Oliver beamed. Yes. But there are rules, Tristan warned. No spending company money without my permission. Oliver muttered. That was one time. No calling the board members peasants. Oliver sighed. Fine. And absolutely no renaming the company Oliver Enterprises. Oliver groaned dramatically. Then what's even the point? Tristan laughed, shaking his head as he ruffled Oliver's hair. He never imagined himself in this life, never thought he'd be the kind of man who sat around playing board games, negotiating with an 8-year-old, or finding happiness in something as simple as a quiet evening with the people he loved. But here he was. And as Hannah leaned against him, as Oliver grinned up at him like he had already claimed victory in more ways than one, Tristan realized something. This wasn't just a second chance. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.